Rashid.
Thank you, Madeleine, and thank you, Jean-Pierre. I was pleased to be asked to speak about this book, but I was concerned because it's the beginning of semester and I have many things I have to do, but I'm very, very glad that I had a chance to look at it because I think that this is a book that, even though it really is very much focused on France, and it's talking about, when it says les Arabes, le destin est le nôtre, the Arabs, their destiny and ours, it's talking about France, has a lot of lessons, I think, for the rest of Europe, but also for the United States. The book does a number of really very interesting things. Besides being a history, a short but very, I think, clear and well-organized history of the relationship between France and the Arab world. But it does a couple of really, I think, very, very important things that have these lessons that I want to stress. One of the things it does is to talk about how France and the Arab world, for really the better part of 2 centuries, and in fact, in the prologue, you go back to Charlemagne and Saint Louis and so on and so forth, for many centuries, but certainly for the better part of 2 centuries, has not just closely tied its destiny to the Middle East or the Arab world, but has tied the destiny of the Middle East to France, to that of France. In other words, by its colonization of Algeria, by its mandates, by its imperialism, by its presence in this part of the world, and later on by bringing tens and tens of thousands of North Africans and Africans to work in France or to fight for France. Marseille was liberated by a division of Algerian riflemen and a division of Moroccan riflemen. 5,000 of them were killed in 1 week of fighting in Algiers, in Marseille. That's the liberation of Marseille was carried out by colonial troops. There was one armored division which wasn't in the city, which was mainly French soldiers. The rest were North Africans and Senegalese of the soldiers who fought in Marseille. These things linked the destinies of the southern shore and the northern shore of the Mediterranean. What we see now is not a refugee flow that came from nowhere or a terrorism that suddenly flowed out of the head of someone named al-Baghdadi who proclaimed himself caliph. It is rather the result of a history, which is really very, very well, I think, detailed in this book. I think it was Chomsky who had a book, Terrorism, Their Terrorism and Our Terrorism. What, in a sense, he's saying is that this jihadi terrorism is not just born of perverse, cruel, brutal fanatics. It is also born of an interaction. And he has an optimistic note in this book by saying only if these people, the Arabs, who have suffered in various ways from very bad government, and I'll talk about that in a minute, only if these people liberate themselves will Europe also be liberated from some of these problems that are a result of this joint destiny. It's a very sophisticated argument, but actually a very simple one. And I asked Jean-Pierre before we started, I hope this book is going to be translated. He said no. He talked to publishers, and they say this is a very French book. That is to say, it's a book directed at and with a focus on France. And that's true. I mean, the parts of it that I have read force me to agree with you. That notwithstanding, I think it has enormous implications that go far beyond France and the Arab world. For one thing, the book talks about the contradiction between French interest, you can call it imperialism or you can call it the colonial side, and between French universal values, about the way in which the universal values had one kind of effect in the Arab world and the way in which France sought its own interests had another kind of effect in the Arab world. But that's not unique to France. That's actually precisely the ambivalence with which Britain and the Arab world, or the United States and the Arab world, regard one another. People in those parts of the world look to French universal values and British universal values and American universal values as values that they either aspire to, or in some cases cherish, or in some cases want to adapt in their own way for their own purposes. But if you look at French institutions in the Arab world, or you look at British or American institutions in the Arab world, American University of Beirut, Collège Protestant in Beirut, I mean, you could talk about literally hundreds, thousands of ways in which these universal values are transmitted. That created one set of links, most of which are positive. On the other hand, we have a whole series of others. And one of the problems is, I think, summed up in something that Danton said. Personne n'aime les missionnaires armés. Now, he wasn't talking about the Arab world. He was talking about French revolutionary armies marching through Europe and imposing the French Revolution at the point of a gun. And what he was saying was, you are completely deluded, you, my fellow revolutionaries, if you think that our universal values can ever be imposed at the point of a gun. It's a brilliant speech. It's a long speech. Mm-hmm. Type it into your browsers, and you'll come up with the whole speech. It goes on, has many other interesting things in it. But this is a very, very important explanation of this ambivalence and of this irony that I've been talking about. On the one hand, France went, for example, to Egypt with 177 savants, great scholars, who created monuments of scholarship that to this day we can consult with profit. On the other hand, the French troops bombarded the city from the citadel, killing hundreds of people to put down a revolt. So les missionnaires armés, armed missionaries, will not carry the right message. And this has been the problem, not just of the contradiction between French universal values and French interests. It's the problem of the contradiction between the same contradictory thrusts in the policies of other great powers like Britain and the United States. And that brings me to what I want to conclude by talking about, which you touch on in this book, but which I think is a further explanation for something that I know has concerned you over the 2 or 3 of your books that I've read. And this is this persistence of extraordinarily dictatorial regimes in the Arab world in a way which defies the trends that have affected most of the rest of the world since the 1970s. As exactly as you just mentioned, starting in 1949 in Syria and concluding in 1969 in Libya, many Arab countries were subject to coup d'etat by military juntas, which established regimes, many of which existed until, some of which still exist, in Egypt, for example, and Algeria, and some of which were overthrown or destroyed, or are in danger of being overthrown or destroyed. Yemen, Syria, and obviously Iraq. Saddam Hussein's regime, Assad's regime, Ali Abdullah Saleh's regime, all of which are rooted in a series of these coups. And you devote a great deal of attention here, correctly, and in other of your work, to these peculiar military regimes. And you say, as you just mentioned, that there seems to be an exception in the Arab world, or an Arab exception. This is not a Muslim exception. Most Muslim countries are not in the Middle East. Most Muslim countries are in South Asia and Southeast Asia. The biggest Muslim country is Indonesia. The second and third largest Muslim populations and fourth are in Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. The overwhelming center of gravity of the Muslim world is 1,500 miles to the east of the Middle East, and most of those countries have democratic governments. Ramshackle, corrupt, like the government of, say, the state of Illinois, or the state of New Jersey, or the city of Chicago. Democratic, but with grave, profound, corrupt problems. So this is not a Muslim problem, as you just said. This is an Arab problem. In fact, it's not even a Middle Eastern problem. In Turkey, you have a democracy with grave problems. In Iran, in a peculiar way, you have a mix of an Islamic theocracy and a democracy. In the Arab world, however, you have the persistence of regimes, the like of which have disappeared for the most part in Latin America, for the most part in Southeast and East Asia, to a large degree even in Africa, and the parallels of which in the communist regimes of Eastern Europe and Russia have also disappeared, but not in the Arab world. And I want to suggest here that while part of the problem that you talk about can be understood in terms of this vexed relationship between the West, the United States, and the great European powers, and the Arab world, part of the problem is actually internal to the Arab world. It's not religion or culture. And it's not just that there were military regimes. There were military regimes in most countries of Latin America. There were military regimes in many countries in Asia, most of which are gone today. I would argue that the problem has to do with a very complex phenomenon, which is which starts with the ascendancy of the oil-producing Arab autocracies in the mid-1970s. What these countries did was to both pump formaldehyde into the veins of regimes that might otherwise have changed, in other words, propping them up, and on the other hand, dissolve all kinds of other bonds that might have led to progressive change over time in the same way that democratic governance took the place of dictatorships in other parts of the world. I would argue that what happened in the 1970s was the greatest possible, with the rise of oil prices and with the dominance in the Arab world, to this day, of the most absolute monarchies on earth. These are countries that have regimes that are pre-Magna Carta. They are pre-Louis XIV. Louis XIV said, "L'État c'est moi." The state is, I am the state. But there were structures. There was a state in France when he said that. There was some kind of check on the power, of the king. That's not true in these absolute monarchies of the Gulf. Now, oil created all kinds of regimes. It created the peculiar regime in Libya, now disappeared. It created the peculiar regime in Iraq, now disappeared. But it created a number of other regimes, which are the ones that have actually come to dominate the Arab world over the last 40-odd years, since the early 70s. And if one wants to look for one of the many root causes, I think, of the Arab exception to this democratic trend globally, this is the problem. And this is an Arab problem, first and foremost. The ideology that drives these killers is not exactly a pure and unvarnished form of Wahhabism, but it has its roots in Wahhabism. That is part of the problem. The second problem is these are not just absolute monarchies within their borders. These are absolute monarchies which, like the Habsburgs in Vienna, like the Romanovs in St. Petersburg, were armed missionaries for autocracy in the rest of their region, just like revolution in Europe was combated by Russia, by Prussia, by Austria, by Britain at the time of the French Revolution, and then by Vienna and by St. Petersburg in the 1830s and 40s and 50s and 60s. So Riyadh, Doha, and Abu Dhabi are the capitals of Arab reaction. They are not just making sure that nobody has the vote in Riyadh or Dubai. They're making sure that nobody has the vote as far afield in the Arab world as their money and their secret services and their weapons and the printing presses they control and the universities in this country and in Europe and all over the Arab world can assure. When they spend their money, they spend it very wisely. They don't just spend it on madrasas. They don't just spend it on mosques. They spend it on university chairs. They spend it on research centers in Europe. They spend it on buying satellite television stations. They spend it on buying pan-Arab newspapers. Hayat is owned by a Saudi member of the royal family. Al-Sharq al-Awsat is owned by a Saudi member of the royal family. Those are the two most important pan-Arab newspapers. Through these and many, many other means that we don't see, this status quo has been maintained in spite of historical forces that in every other part of the world have prevailed. And the last thing I want to say is this is not just an Arab problem. This is our problem, because these are not just Arab regimes. The oldest alliance of the United States outside of Europe is with Saudi Arabia. In 1933, American oil companies, with the backing of the Roosevelt administration, cut a deal. That deal is the basis of what became Aramco, which is the basis of the American-Saudi relationship. 1933 is long before any American alliance was established with any country anywhere else. Okay? The United States had closer relations with France and Britain. Those are the only other countries that you can talk about in the same terms. This is before Israel was established. This is before NATO was established and Turkey became a NATO ally. If you look at the relationships between these absolute oil autocracies, these absolute monarchies in the Gulf, you will see that they are firmly intertwined with the Western economy. They own billions of dollars of real estate in this city, or in Paris, or in London. They underwrite the balance sheets of Airbus and Boeing and General Dynamics and Raytheon. They would not make profits if some of these arms companies, for example, were it not for the fact that the Gulf monarchies bought in 2012 $44 billion worth of weapons. Highest arms sales in the history of the United States were in that year. Of the 60-odd billion dollars, 44 billion were sold to Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and so forth. This means that it is not these regimes holding themselves up by themselves. This means that they have enormously powerful lobbies. The French president sells Rafale everywhere he goes. And the American presidents don't do that. They let the Secretary of State do it for them. But it's the same process. Cameron does it himself. And it's not just weapons. It's not just oil. It's not just airplanes. It's a whole network. It's banking. It's a whole network of economic relationships which underpin the maintenance of the most reactionary, most obscurantist, and in my view, in some respects, most dangerous regimes on earth. Now, the terrorists that killed so many people in Paris and in Tunisia and in Beirut and in many other places, and are killing on a ratio of about 10 or 20 to 1 people in the Arab world and people in Europe and the United States. It's not a direct line to these regimes, but a huge amount of the money is coming from these countries, whether it's from their governments or whether it's from their elites, privately or publicly. Moreover, we have in the Middle East today a rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia, an artificial, in my view, rivalry, which is spurred a great deal of the intolerance and a great deal of the fanaticism and a great deal of the terrorism from which we are all suffering. One of the very fine things about this book is that Jean-Pierre doesn't just talk about the history of the Middle East or the history of the Middle Eastern-French relationship. He talks about exactly how that impacts on issues that are of enormous concern to all of us today. Not just terrorism and not just refugees, but what is to be the future of the relationship between this important part of the non-Western world and the West. So I very strongly recommend you to buy this book. And if you don't know French, it's worth learning French, because it's not going to be translated. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jean-Pierre, will you respond to Rashid?
I will first blush and then respond. No, well, of course, I'm thrilled by what I just heard, and I just wanted to add, following, of course, on these lines and step, that when I say a common, in a common destiny, you have also common enemies. And I wrote repeatedly in the French press and in the Arab press that the murderers of freedom are the same in France and in Tunisia, and in general in Europe and in the Arab world. And in the case of France and Tunisia, it's literal. I mean, the people who masterminding the terror attacks...
You talk about that in the last chapter.
The people who masterminding the terror attacks against Charlie Hebdo and Hyper Cacher. Never forget that there was the Charlie Hebdo, but there was the anti-Semitic massacre that followed just today after that, and they were intimately linked. It was not just an attack on a newspaper. And the same people were the one who masterminded the attack on the Bardo National Museum a few weeks later. The same way, after the Black Friday of November 13, you had a terror attack in the center, in downtown Tunis, against the Presidential Guard. And they were the same people behind it. So it's not only the issue in a little bit ethereal, but it's really the same people, and it will become more and more obvious with ISIS moving more and more of its apparatus to Libya, where it is relying even more on jihadi who are often dual national French-Tunisian. So, shared destiny is not only a nice, joint program, it can be also a dual binational French-Tunisian jihadi. Just seizing the opportunity to make, very long story a little bit shorter. I do believe that we are still in the dynamics of the Nahda, or the Arab Renaissance of the 19th century. And I do believe that the strength and the resilience of the Nahda was grounded on the fact that it was a synthesis between nationalist and Islamist. Because at that time they were not, portraying themselves or even considering themselves as pure nationalist or pure Islamist, character like Kawakibi, probably one of the greatest thinker and activist of that time. He was at the same time writing al-Qura about, an elected caliphate. It was some kind of fantasy, and he was writing about authoritarianism, istibdad, and the way to fight it in a liberal way for him. But there was a space in the Arab world, the only space, the only territory that was at the same time not colonized, not occupied, neither by the Western powers, nor by the Ottoman Empire, and at the same time producing an anti-Nahda ideology, which is Wahhabism. That was based on the famous pact of 1747 between the Saud family, that is still the ruling family, in a country that is the only country in the world whose citizens are named from the ruling dynasty. You don't call Jordanians Hashemians. They are Jordanians. You don't even talk the Spaniards Bourbonians. They are Spaniards. Even the Catalans, and I'm from a Catalan background. So so the sense of patrimonialism is really reached such extreme that we don't even see it anymore. But how did this anti-Nahda ideology broke into the realm and into the core of the Arab world and of Islam in that case, which is how did it come to control Mecca and Medina in 1925? Because the family, the leadership that had been at the vanguard of the Arab Revolution or Arab Revolt, Thawra al-Arabiya, had been betrayed by the Western powers, the Hashemites, who were supposed to be the one ruling an Arab kingdom from Damascus, with a general congress and conference of nationalists being convened there, and constitutional process being on the way. This was not only blatantly crushed, mainly by France, but also by Great Britain in the establishment of the mandate, but also this literally opened the way to the two holiest sites of Islam, to the Wahhabis. 10 years before the U.S. oil companies led the ground for what is the most enduring alliance until today between America and Saudi Arabia. So you had already this. That was the first, not the first, but the internal betrayal of the Nahda dynamics by indigenous forces that were moved by an anti-Nahda ideology, Wahhabism, call it whatever today, Salafism, but it's still the same one. And the second tragedy, historical tragedy, was the divorce between nationalist and Islamist in what has been described in Rashid Khalidi's book and before by Malcolm Kerr as the Arab Cold War, pitting nationalist Egypt, quote unquote, against Islamist Saudi Arabia, which was a disaster because it really ruined the mobilization of nationalists and Islamists together, first against the colonial power, and then for collective liberation. Because if there is something sure, is that if there is a winner and a loser between nationalists and Islamists, then everybody loses. And if Tunisia, despite all its problems right now, has reached this stage of a successful transition, which doesn't mean that everything is nice and rosy, but they have established a second republic. But they did it in the reasonable way, and the reasonable way means you don't vote too much. You know, the idea that instant democracy means voting all the time, you know, like in Iraq. Look at the state of Iraq. They are voting all the time in Iraq, twice, 3 times a year. Look at the result. Or in Egypt, they voted for 3 constitutions in 3 years, each one, you know, defending the contrary of the previous one, and each time it was adopted. In Tunisia, they didn't vote. There was no referendum for the constitution. They voted for a constituent assembly whose mandate was to establish a constitution. And that was, and by the way, if you look at, you know, there was no referendum, if I remember well, for the US Constitution. That's not the way those founding texts are adopted. They have to be adopted through an assembly.
They were adopted then by the state legislatures.
Yes,
they had to vote.
Yes, they had to vote. But it was not like, you know, in Egypt calling, you know, on referendum. You know, and it's so it's this way you can establish a functional new social and political pact addressing the diversity of the political currents. But obviously, in order to be part of this pact, you have to accept that the sovereignty is in the hand of the people. And today we see clearly in the Arab world, and I will finish on that, that the divorce, the war, the conflict is not between Islamists and nationalists, but is between forces who accept that people have the ultimate power, that they are the source of legitimacy, and forces who consider it's not the case, whether that the ultimate decision lies in the hand of Sisi in Egypt or lies in the hand of the Saud family in Saudi Arabia.
Or Baghdadi.
Or Baghdadi, of course, Baghdadi. And by the way, I don't think Baghdadi is the one running the show even inside ISIS. I believe he's much a front, and that former, you know, Saddam Hussein officials are the one really behind this masquerade. You know, Baghdadi is the only one who can speak from a pulpit. You know, the other one are religiously illiterate. So, you know, since they are Islamic states, they need somebody, you know. So the guy has a BA in Islamic studies. Now, in his new CV, he pretends he's a PhD. So it's not only, you know, even a caliph needs, you know, a fake university diploma. you know, it's incredible. At least there is something in academia that even caliphs bow to, you know. They pretend to have, you know, university credentials. So, I think that this, and if you will take this distinction, instead of being plunged into this endless and vain debate about Islam and democracy, about secularism and nationalism, but we just, okay, the very simple question, do you accept that people are the power or not? And then it's very simple. And the immense majority of the Arabs are ready to go for that, and are ready to fight against the other one. But we have to, you know, open up the opportunities, help them, and helping democratic movements doesn't mean we train them and equip them. That's recipe for disaster. That means that you support them and you accept the consequences if there are consequences of the vote. You don't consider that if they vote the wrong way, then they are bad people and they have to be punished for it, you know. But that's it. Thank you.
Jean-Pierre, you connect what's happening now in Tunisia, the constitutionalism of Tunisia, to its nationalist history, you know, to this constitutionalist history of the 19th century, you know, the Destour, in fact, the constitution. So, and you know, argue that the difference between what's happened in Egypt and the way things have played out in Tunisia has a lot to do with the difference in their histories of nationalism. Can you talk a little bit about that, where that Tunisian constitutionalism came from? And, clearly that's something to advocate for, but do you see a potential for that now happening in other countries?
Dustur, so constitution, is the key word in Tunisian political history, and it has been there not only since the Dustur nationalist movement was established in the 20s, first old Dusturs and neo-Dustur with Bourguiba, but it has been there since mid-19th century. It is really, and just to give you an anecdote, Tunisia abolished slavery 2 years before France. I have been addressed in public debate and they say, oh, but you shouldn't say that because we had abolished slavery in Metropole. So I found it, very striking, that some French cannot even accept that Tunisian abolished slavery before them, that, and they are ready to go to the very deep lengths of considering that Antilles and Réunion were not fully part of France because you had still slaves over there, but not slaves anymore in Marseille and in Paris. Wow, what. So you have always this idea that, no, we are the one calling the shots. We have been there before, which is not true. Historically, it's not true. A lot of things were invented, a lot of concepts were forged before, and in other places, and in Europe, even in recent history. So certainly, if you take the Nahda in Tunisia and Egypt in the 19th century, you have already the very specific dimension of, in Egypt, a state, a caricature of a bottom-up process, with enlightened despotism, imposing this modernization process, sometimes with very strong repression, while in Tunisia you had the need to address the various parts of the society and of the territory through a constitutional process that was, that in fact predated the Tanzimat or the Ottoman reforms, while in most of the history books you always go back to the Ottomans as though the Arabs had to wait for the Turks to become open before, daring to do it themselves. It was historically it's wrong. And if you take the first Tunisian constitution, it's a secular text. It's a secular text. The main concept is maslaha, common good, common interest. And they don't even mention the fact that the ruler has to be Muslim. And they don't even, the only mention of Islam is that it should not be contradictory to the principles of Islam. But Bourguiba, the so-called secular Bourguiba, he didn't do anything else when he established the constitution of modern Tunisia, because the ambiguity of the Article 1st, which by the way has been reinforced in the actual constitution of Tunisia, was playing in Arabic on the fact that Tunisia and state are feminine. So you don't know if, because Tunisia is a sovereign state, its language is Arabic and its religion is Islam. So you don't know if the state religion is Islam or if it is Tunisia's religion, and it was ambiguity. A lot of questions that have been asked today, first, they can never be answered in the real world, because the real world is complex, and everyone has to deal with his identity, religious identity, national identity. But if you really want to force people to choose, then you have the breakup between the nationalists and the Islamists. That is a recipe for disaster. But Tunisia, because we are talking about the Wahhabis, in 1810, the then ruler of the first Saudi state, it took them 3 times to eventually accomplish what is today Saudi Arabia. So the then ruler had written, we're talking about 1810, to the Tunis Bey, so the ruler of Tunis, saying, you are not good Muslim. You have to convert to Wahhabism. We will send you preachers. You know, nothing new under the sun. And the Tunisians were a little bit taken aback. You know, who are those people? We never heard about them. Saud, what is that? Saud, Abdel Wahab. So they convened the Zaytuna, you know, the religious scholars. And they wrote a very elaborate letter. And again, I'm sure if you can Google, you can find it, and you can find a lot of food for thought into it. Because in 1810, everything was already said. You have no right to tell us what should be our Islam. You have no right. Absolutely no. And by the way, Zaytuna was established 1,000 years ago while you were, well, we respect you, but we don't know really where you were because day before yesterday, nobody knew about you. So it's said in a very courteous manner, but it could be very useful until today, certainly.
Thank you.